The house had a peculiar charm to it, a kind of quiet beauty that felt untouched by time. When I first walked through the narrow front gate and saw its weathered stone steps, I felt as though I was entering a world left behind. It wasn't what I'd imagined for my first home, but I loved the way the ivy clung to the walls, the towering trees that framed the property, casting shifting shadows as the wind rustled through the leaves. Inside, the air felt still, almost thick with history. The wallpaper was faded, the wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, and an old smell lingered in the corners, as if it had seeped into the very bones of the house. I spent my first day cleaning, unpacking boxes, and arranging furniture, trying to fill the empty spaces and make it feel a little more like my own. But as evening settled, casting the rooms in dim, golden light, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease, something that seemed to rise up from the quiet shadows gathering along the walls. By nightfall, the house transformed, taking on an almost haunting atmosphere. It was quiet as a house could be, and every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the floors, the hum of the refrigerator, even the occasional rustle of leaves against the window. All of it felt louder, like a reminder that I was alone. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just nerves, that any old house would make its fair share of strange noises. But as I lay in bed that night, struggling to settle in, I heard something unexpected, a faint sound, distant but clear, drifting through the walls. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe the house settling. But then I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, soft and high, echoing through the silence. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, staring into the darkness, trying to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the remnants of a dream. But I hadn't been sleeping, and the laughter continued, faint but there, weaving its way through the stillness. I stayed awake, my heart thudding in my chest, listening as the laughter faded into silence, replaced by the familiar creaks and groans of the house settling. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off to sleep, though I couldn't shake the memory of that soft, eerie sound. The next morning, with sunlight pouring in through the windows, everything felt different. The house seemed warm, almost inviting, and I could almost convince myself that the laughter I'd heard was just a figment of my imagination, the kind of strange sound an old house might make in the dead of night. I went about my day, unpacking the last of my things and settling into my new routine, doing my best to forget the unsettling moment from the night before. But as evening approached, a strange sense of dread crept over me, a tension that I couldn't shake. When the shadows lengthened, draping the rooms in darkness, I found myself listening again, half expecting that same laughter to return. And then, just as the silence grew unbearable, I heard it. A soft, chilling laugh, just like the night before. This time, it was louder, more distinct, as if it was coming from somewhere within the house. I froze, every instinct screaming for me to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But the laughter didn't stop. It echoed through the darkness, growing louder, until it was joined by another sound, one that sent a chill down my spine, the sharp, unmistakable sound of glass shattering. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to guide me out of bed. I crept through the house, moving slowly, trying to steady my breath as I made my way down the hall. The laughter had stopped, but the silence that followed was thick, pressing in on me, filling the house with a sense of something lurking, waiting. My footsteps echoed as I passed through the dimly lit rooms, my heart pounding with every step. I checked every room, every corner, but there was nothing out of place, no sign of the broken glass I'd heard. But then, as I passed the doorway leading to the basement, I felt an inexplicable pull. a sense that something was waiting for me down there, hidden in the shadows. The door to the basement had been closed since I moved in. I hadn't even thought to open it, assuming it was nothing more than a storage area. But now, staring at it, I felt a shiver run through me. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left it open just enough to invite me down. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, torn between the fear gnawing at me and the curiosity that urged me forward. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door fully and peered down into the darkness. The basement stairs creaked beneath my feet as I descended, the air growing colder with each step, a faint smell of dust and decay filling my lungs. My phone's flashlight cut through the blackness, illuminating shelves lined with strange objects that cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. And then, at the far end of the room, I saw them. A row of small dolls, each one crafted from jagged shards of glass, stood on a dusty shelf. They were misshapen, eerie, with faces crudely etched onto the glass, each expression frozen in terror or sorrow. I felt a chill as I stared at them, drawn in by a strange, almost hypnotic feeling. And then, somewhere in the dark, I heard it again. A soft, chilling laugh, as though it was coming from the dolls themselves. The sight of those glass dolls lingered in my mind long after I climbed out of the basement. Sleep was out of the question. I lay awake, replaying the image of each twisted face, each expression etched into the broken shards as if they were frozen in a moment of fear or sorrow. Every creak of the house seemed amplified, and every shadow stretched farther than it should. My eyes drifted to the ceiling, tracing the patterns of light from the street lamp outside. But the faint sound of laughter echoed in my mind, refusing to let me drift off. Morning arrived slowly, bringing with it a small sense of relief. Under the light of day, the unsettling events of the night before seemed almost surreal. I busied myself with errands, grabbing coffee in town and meeting a few locals, trying to convince myself that everything I'd experienced was just the product of an overactive imagination. Yet the weight of curiosity lingered, tugging at me, filling me with questions I couldn't ignore. The townspeople were friendly, warm, even, but when I mentioned the house, a few of them shared uneasy glances. No one seemed to know much about its history, and those who did kept their answers vague, avoiding any details. An older woman behind the counter of the general store cast me a worried look when I asked about previous owners, simply shaking her head and muttering, "That house has seen too much." I left the store with an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. As dusk settled, a familiar tension crept back into the house. I tried to distract myself, but as soon as the night deepened, the silence returned, thick and oppressive. My thoughts drifted back to the basement, to those dolls and the strange, uneasy laughter that had drifted through the darkness. The mystery gnawed at me, tugging at my curiosity. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn back to the basement door. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and descended the stairs, feeling the cold, stale air wrap around me like a shroud. The basement was still, silent, but the sense of something watching lingered, an invisible presence that seemed to lurk just beyond the reach of my light. My phone's flashlight flickered slightly as I approached the shelf, illuminating the rows of glass dolls. I stared at them, feeling a strange pull, a sense that each doll held something within, something waiting to be acknowledged. Their faces, crude yet expressive, seemed to shift under the dim light, their sorrowful eyes catching the faintest glint of my flashlight. And then, on a small piece of paper tucked between two of the dolls, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A handwritten note, worn and yellowed with age. With trembling hands, I unfolded the note. The writing was faded, but I could make out enough to piece together a story. It spoke of a woman who had lived in this house long ago, a reclusive figure who'd lost her own child to illness. The note described her obsession with preserving the souls of children, a dark compulsion that had driven her to do unthinkable things. My hands shook as I read the final lines. She believed each doll held a fragment of a child's soul. She wanted them to have company for eternity. A chill ran through me as I set the note down, feeling as though the eyes of every doll were on me, watching, waiting. I stumbled back, the cold dread settling in my chest as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. These dolls, each one was a prison, a cruel vessel trapping fragments of lost souls within. Children who had been drawn here, who had somehow been ensnared, their laughter echoing in the silence, bound to this place. I turned to leave, desperate to escape the basement's suffocating grip, but a soft rustling sound stopped me in my tracks. The laughter had returned, faint but undeniable, drifting through the cold air. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement on the shelf. I turned back, and there, in the dim light, the dolls seemed to shift, their faces distorted, twisted with a kind of anger I couldn't understand. The laughter grew louder surrounding me, echoing off the walls as though the room itself was alive. I backed away, my pulse racing, my hands slick with sweat as I clutched my phone, barely able to breathe. The dolls seemed to lean forward, each face contorting into an expression of despair, as if pleading with me, as if they were reaching out for help. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from every corner of the room, I heard a faint, chilling whisper. "Stay with us." The words filled the space, heavy and suffocating. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the stairs in my haste to escape. My flashlight blinked out for a moment, plunging the basement into total darkness, and I froze, the terror rising in my chest. I could feel them, those eyes on me, watching, waiting, as if they were calling to me, urging me to stay, to join them in whatever twisted prison they were bound to. Finally, I scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I pressed my back against the door, my pulse pounding, listening for any hint of movement from below. The house had fallen silent, but the weight of what I had discovered lingered, an oppressive presence that filled every corner. I stumbled to the living room, collapsing onto the couch, my mind racing with questions and fears I couldn't shake. The laughter had stopped. The house was silent once more, but the knowledge remained. Each of those dolls held a part of something dark, something twisted, and now they knew I'd found them. I felt a shiver run through me, the echo of that whisper still ringing in my ears. "Stay with us." But I knew I couldn't stay. Not after what I'd seen, after what I'd heard. Those children, their voices, their laughter, they were trapped, bound to this place by something cruel, something that had once lived within these walls. And now it seemed they wanted me to stay with them. I sat in the living room, unable to shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that those eyes I'd felt in the basement were somehow following me. My mind raced, piecing together everything I'd seen and read, but the overwhelming sense of dread made it hard to think straight. I needed to get out, to leave the house and its horrors behind, but every time I moved, a deep, heavy whisper echoed in my ears. "Stay with us." The air felt colder, heavier, as though the entire house was conspiring to keep me inside. My legs trembled as I forced myself to stand, casting nervous glances at every dark corner, every shadow that seemed to shift as I moved. I reached for my phone, considering calling someone, anyone, but a strange realization settled over me. No one would understand. No one would believe me if I tried to explain the twisted nightmare hidden within this house. I was alone. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft, almost inaudible shuffling coming from the basement door. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned to face it, barely able to breathe. The door was still closed, but I could feel something behind it, something waiting, listening. The shuffling grew louder, joined by that familiar, chilling laughter, as if the house itself was filled with a presence, something ancient and malicious that had waited far too long. I took a shaky step toward the door, feeling as though I was moving in a dream, my body controlled by something beyond myself. The laughter grew louder, echoing in my mind, filling the room with a dark energy that sent chills through me. With trembling hands, I grasped the doorknob and pulled it open, my stomach twisting as I felt the cold air of the basement drift up, carrying with it a strange, sour smell. As I descended the stairs, the sound of laughter transformed into faint whispers, voices overlapping in a cacophony of desperate pleas and mournful cries. It was as if each doll, each trapped soul was speaking to me, urging me to stay, to join them in their cursed prison. The light from my phone flickered weakly as I reached the bottom, casting long shadows over the rows of glass dolls that lined the shelves, their faces twisted and sorrowful. One doll in particular caught my eye, its face more lifelike, more detailed, as though it held a deeper sense of pain than the others. It stared back at me with hollow eyes, and I felt as though it was reaching out, pleading for something I couldn't give. My chest tightened, and I could feel the weight of those lost souls pressing down on me, surrounding me. Their whispers grew louder, more insistent, forming a single, chilling phrase that echoed in my mind. "We need you." I stumbled backward, barely able to breathe as I tried to turn and flee. But as I backed away, I heard the soft sound of glass shifting, and I watched in horror as the dolls began to move, slowly leaning forward, each face contorting into an expression of pain and sorrow. They seemed to come alive, inching closer, their hollow eyes fixed on me as though they could see right through me. I turned to run, but the air grew thick, almost solid, and it felt as though invisible hands were reaching out, tugging at me, urging me to stay. The laughter returned, louder and more frenzied, echoing through the basement, filling every inch of the room with a dark, oppressive energy. My flashlight blinked, casting flickering shadows over the dolls, each one seeming to move closer with every flash of light. Desperate, I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, swallowed by the overwhelming presence pressing in on me. I clawed my way toward the stairs, my vision blurring as the air grew colder, each step feeling like a struggle against some invisible force that clung to me, refusing to let me go. As I reached the base of the stairs, I felt a small, sharp tug at my ankle. I looked down, horrified to see one of the glass dolls lying on the step, its jagged face turned upward, its mouth twisted into a ghastly smile. I kicked it away, but it only tumbled a few steps before coming to rest, its hollow eyes still fixed on me. The whispers grew louder, almost desperate, and I could feel their pull, their longing, the deep, twisted need to trap me, to make me one of them. With one final burst of strength, I lunged up the stairs, my heart pounding as I stumbled into the hallway and slammed the door behind me. The house fell silent, but the weight of their whispers lingered, pressing in from every corner, as though they were still watching, still waiting. I didn't stop to look back. I ran, grabbing my keys and rushing out the front door, barely pausing to lock it behind me. Outside, the night air felt like a lifeline, cool and fresh against my skin. But even as I left the house, I could still hear the faint sound of laughter, trailing behind me, following me into the darkness. I climbed into my car, my hands shaking as I started the engine, casting one final glance at the house. The windows stared back, dark and empty, But somewhere within, I knew those glass dolls remained, waiting for the next person who might stumble upon them. As I drove away, the laughter faded, but the memory of those hollow eyes and twisted faces clung to me, a reminder of the souls that remained trapped in that cursed place, bound to the shadows, forever calling for someone to join them. There was something strange about that door. At the end of the upstairs hallway, it sat slightly ajar, as though it had been left open on purpose. I hadn't touched it since moving in, had no reason to. The room was empty, just bare walls and a wooden floor that creaked underfoot. But every time I walked past, the door was open, a few inches at most, despite my closing it firmly the night before. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was the draft. The house was old, after all, thick, creaking beams, narrow windows, and the faint smell of dust that seemed to linger in every room. I closed the door, twisting the knob to make sure it latched, and went back to my evening. But later that night, as I passed by the hall on my way to bed, I found it open again. It was small things like this that added to the house's unsettling charm. I'd convinced myself it was nothing, and yet the feeling gnawed at me. Each time I closed that door, I'd hear it creak open later, quiet but unmistakable, like someone or something insisted on keeping it that way. At night, I would catch myself glancing down the hall, watching for any sign of movement. Nothing ever seemed out of place, but the silence felt different around that room. Cold. Then came the laughter. Soft at first, almost faint enough to dismiss as wind or the low hum of the house itself settling in the cold. But as the nights passed, the sound grew clearer, distinct. A soft, childlike giggle that seemed to float from the end of the hall, slipping under the door, carrying with it an icy chill that raised every hair on my arms. I started to dread that sound, the way it echoed in the silence, hollow and far too real. One night, fed up, I decided to confront whatever it was. I marched down the hall, hands clenched, forcing myself to ignore the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. I swung the door open and stepped into the room, my breath catching in the icy air. The room was empty, the bare floorboards stretching into the shadows where moonlight spilled faintly through a window. The cold was almost unbearable, biting, as though the very air were frozen. And that silence? It pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. I backed out slowly, feeling a strange, invisible weight settle over me as I closed the door. But the second I did, the laughter returned, louder this time, echoing through the hallway. I shut the door firmly, twisting the knob, and quickly walked back to my room, trying to shake the unease clinging to me like a shadow. Hours later, lying in bed, I heard the creak. The door was open again. I tried to ignore it. For days, I told myself the sounds were just the old house settling, the laughter a trick of the mind from too many late nights and long hours alone. But each evening, as the shadows deepened and the house fell into silence, that door continued to defy logic. I would close it, lock it even, and yet by morning it was open again, the slightest crack taunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. The laughter grew louder each night, echoing from beyond the door, as though something on the other side was growing more amused, more aware. The house was old, yes, but this felt different. It was a darkness that felt alive, a presence that lurked just beyond my line of sight, and the chill that filled the hallway outside that room was unlike anything I'd felt anywhere else in the house. It seeped into the walls, numbing my skin as soon as I stepped within reach of the door. I started to dread the nights. Each time I went to close that door, the laughter would return, faint at first but unmistakable, building slowly as though the very walls were mocking my efforts. It was never loud, but it was persistent, lingering in the air like a whisper just beyond my hearing. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep my mind on my work, but it was always there, just on the edge of my thoughts. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, I made a decision. I would go into that room, I would find whatever it was haunting me, and I would put an end to it. I didn't care if it was foolish, if there was a perfectly logical explanation. I needed to face it, to know what was hiding beyond that door. I stepped into the hallway, every nerve on edge as I approached the door. The air grew colder with each step, a chill that wrapped around me like an unwelcome embrace. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, and I hesitated, a strange dread settling over me. But I forced myself to push it open, stepping into the dark room beyond. The silence was heavy, thick enough to choke on. I stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness, half expecting to see something lurking in the corners, something waiting in the shadows. But the room was empty. Bare walls, bare floors, and that biting cold that seemed to settle over everything. I took a step forward, feeling the floor creak beneath me, the sound sharp in the oppressive silence, and then I felt it, a presence. It was faint, like the brush of cold air against my skin, but it was there, watching, waiting. I turned slowly, feeling the weight of invisible eyes on me, but there was nothing, only the cold, empty room. I backed up, my heart racing, the laughter echoing faintly in my ears, as though it was coming from somewhere far, far away. I reached for the doorknob, intending to shut the door and walk away, but something held me there, a feeling that I was not alone, and then the door slammed shut. I jumped, spinning around to face it, my heart pounding in my chest. The room grew colder, the air thickening with a darkness that felt almost tangible. I grabbed the doorknob, twisting it, but it wouldn't budge. The laughter returned, louder this time, filling the room with a sound that was both mocking and chilling. I pulled at the doorknob, my fingers slipping as panic set in. It was locked, the handle unyielding in my grip. The cold in the room intensified, biting into my skin, sinking into my bones. My breath fogged the air, each exhale a reminder of how isolated I was in that darkness. The laughter filled the space around me, weaving in and out of the silence like something alive, something that enjoyed watching me struggle. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The laughter faded, replaced by a deep, almost tangible silence. And then I felt it, a presence moving closer, brushing against my arm, leaving a trail of icy numbness. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the wall, my eyes darting around the room, desperate to catch a glimpse of whatever was hiding in the darkness. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, a faint silhouette that seemed to shift and contort as it moved toward me. It wasn't human, not exactly. It was more like a distortion, a ripple in the air, darker than the surrounding shadows, as though it were pulling the darkness into itself. The laughter returned, softer now, but more sinister, curling around me like an invisible hand. My back was pressed against the wall, my only escape blocked by the locked door. I reached for my phone, fumbling with trembling fingers as I tried to shine some light into the room. But as soon as the beam cut through the darkness, the presence vanished, retreating to the far corner, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. The laughter stopped, leaving me in a silence that felt more terrifying than any sound. The air thickened, pressing down on me, and I felt an overwhelming urge to escape, to break free of whatever had trapped me in this room. I pounded on the door, shouting, but the walls seemed to swallow the sound, trapping it inside with me. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and chilling, whispering from the shadows, "Stay with me." The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that made my skin crawl. It was pleading, almost desperate, as though it had been waiting, watching, hoping for someone to hear it. I froze, every muscle tense, listening as the voice repeated itself, each word dripping with a longing that was both haunting and cruel. "Stay with me." I backed away, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But the shadow only grew darker, closer, stretching toward me like an endless void. The cold intensified, a numbing chill that stole the strength from my legs, forcing me down to my knees. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, trapped in that suffocating silence as the darkness closed in around me. Desperation took hold, and I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing against something smooth and cold. It was the doorknob. I twisted it with every ounce of strength I had left, feeling a faint click as the lock released. The door swung open, flooding the room with light, breaking the grip of the shadow as I stumbled out. Moving into the old house was meant to be a new start, a way to leave everything behind and embrace the quiet I thought I needed. The divorce had been messy, draining, and I wanted nothing more than to be away from people, somewhere I could settle into silence. When I saw the house, something about it appealed to me instantly. Maybe it was the isolation, far from the city lights and noise, or the look of age in every cracked wall and creaky floorboard. It was nestled at the end of a winding road, with only a few neighboring houses scattered miles away. The real estate agent warned me about the upkeep an old place like this required, but I barely listened. I was entranced by its lonely beauty. The house was a shadow of its former self, draped in dark wood and layers of dust that hinted at years of vacancy. Its imposing structure stood tall against a backdrop of bare trees, their branches casting eerie shadows across the walls. A rusty gate led to an overgrown garden, and broken windowsills hinted at the winds that had swept through for decades. I felt drawn to it, almost as if it had been waiting for me. But the first night was strange. I was lying in bed, trying to get comfortable, listening to the kind of silence that only a place so far from civilization could offer. The quiet was almost deafening, but somewhere in that silence, I thought I heard something else. A faint murmur, like whispers echoing through the walls. I dismissed it, blaming it on old plumbing or the house settling into the ground. Houses like this were full of odd sounds, right? I let it slide. After all, I'd had a long day, and exhaustion was weighing on me. But as the nights passed, the murmurs became harder to ignore. At first, it was just faint enough to be brushed off as background noise. But then, the whispers began to take shape, almost as though words were being formed in the spaces between the creaks of the wooden floorboards and the rustling of the old curtains. I would sit up in bed, straining my ears, but the moment I tried to listen closely, the sounds would fade back into nothingness. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Living alone in a place like this came with quirks, didn't it? I spent most of my days exploring the house, uncovering bits and pieces of its past life. There were old portraits hung in the hallway, showing faces long forgotten, looking out with expressions that seemed both stern and haunted. I spent hours cleaning, patching up walls, and rearranging furniture, trying to make the place feel more like a home. And yet, every night, the whispers would start up again, faintly, just as I was about to fall asleep. One night, however, the whispers grew louder. I lay awake, frozen, as the murmurs transformed into something unsettling. My name, repeated over and over, as if being chanted by voices that had been trapped within the walls. My pulse quickened. I got out of bed, my hands trembling, and moved through the dark corridors, searching for any logical explanation. Every step I took seemed to echo back at me, as though the house itself was alive, listening, waiting. The lights flickered as I wandered the halls, shadows stretching and shifting in ways that felt unnatural. In the kitchen, the light above the sink blinked sporadically, illuminating the dusty counters and cast-iron pots hanging on the wall. The whispers seemed to follow me, always just a few steps behind. I could feel a chill in the air, a coldness that crept up my spine and made my skin prickle. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as the remnants of my imagination or the lingering fatigue that hung over me from sleepless nights. But deep down, something inside me felt the weight of an old sorrow lingering in the air, like an invisible hand pressing down on my chest. I could sense it, a presence lurking within these walls, an anger that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. But even then, I refused to acknowledge it. Instead, I retreated to bed, pulling the covers over myself and willing myself to fall asleep. My thoughts were a mess of unease and exhaustion, each whisper etching itself into my memory. It was as though the house was trying to communicate, desperately, a warning I couldn't understand. And so I lay there, paralyzed. As the whispers surrounded me, they grew louder, their rhythm picking up until they filled every corner of the room. Just as suddenly, the lights went out, plunging me into darkness. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, an instinctual dread that gripped me tightly. As I lay in the dark, I knew something was here with me, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. The whispers haunted me night after night, filling the dark silence with an ever-present dread. Every attempt to dismiss those creaks or sounds of an old house crumbling was quickly shattered by the growing intensity with which they surrounded me. It was as if the house was growing impatient with my ignorance, trying harder each night to make itself heard. I was no longer sleeping properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel something in the air, watching, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I began leaving the lights on in the hallway, hoping their dim glow would ease my nerves, but the shadows seemed to grow thicker, mocking my efforts. One particularly cold night, as I lay in bed trying to ignore the whispers that had once again started their nightly torment, I heard something different, a faint, rhythmic creaking coming from above. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. It was unmistakable, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving in the attic directly above me. The sound echoed through the wooden beams, filling the room with a dreadful anticipation. The hairs on my arms stood on end as the weight of realization set in. I wasn't alone in this house. I lay there, frozen in place, debating whether I should investigate or simply wait for morning. But the footsteps continued, each step growing louder, more insistent, like whoever, or whatever, was up there wanted me to come. I tried to push the thought from my mind, telling myself that it had to be the old wood settling, a branch brushing against the roof, something, anything other than what my instincts were telling me. But the rhythm was too human, too deliberate, as if someone were pacing back and forth, waiting for me to respond. Finally, with my heart hammering in my chest, I couldn't bear it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand, and with trembling hands, crept out of bed. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I made my way to the attic door, which I hadn't dared to open since I'd moved in. The door itself seemed like an ominous presence, a boundary I was reluctant to cross, but the footsteps continued, unrelenting, urging me to come closer. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, feeling the chill that radiated from it. It was colder here, inexplicably so, as if the air itself were frozen in time. Finally, I turned the knob and pushed the door open, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the cold, stale air. The attic was exactly what one would expect in a house like this, full of old boxes, forgotten furniture, and the smell of damp wood. But there was something else, something that made the air feel heavier, thicker, like a weight pressing down on me. I scanned the room with my flashlight, my eyes darting from one dark corner to another, looking for any sign of movement. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a small door, almost hidden in the farthest corner of the attic. It was an odd sight, too small for a grown adult to enter comfortably, yet tall enough to suggest it led somewhere significant. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me in a chaotic blend of anger and sorrow. I moved toward the door, feeling an undeniable pull, like something was drawing me in. With trembling hands, I opened it and found a small, cramped space filled with old books and papers, scattered haphazardly as though left in a hurry. A thick layer of dust coated everything, indicating that no one had touched these items for years. My flashlight landed on a stack of tattered notebooks, their pages yellowed with age. Curiosity outweighed my fear as I reached for the first one and opened it. Inside, I found handwritten entries from decades ago. The name on the cover read Crawford, the surname of the family that had once lived here. I flipped through the pages, reading accounts of mundane, everyday life, children's birthdays, family dinners, stories of a quiet, peaceful life. But as I continued, the tone of the entries shifted, becoming more frantic, more fearful. Mrs. Crawford had started documenting strange events in the house. Sounds, shadows, objects moving on their own. The final pages were barely legible, scrawled in a desperate hand, detailing how the family felt as though they were being watched, followed, tormented. One entry stood out, chilling me to the bone. Mrs. Crawford had written about a presence she could feel watching her children at night. An invisible weight pressing against her chest, whispers in the dark, calling her name. The entry ended abruptly, with no explanation, no goodbye. The final words scratched into the page read, "They are coming." A cold sweat dripped down my back as I closed the notebook, heart racing. I felt the weight of something ancient and angry surrounding me, like the house itself was alive with memories of its past inhabitants. I stumbled back, dropping the notebook, my breathing rapid and shallow as the reality set in. The Crawfords hadn't simply left this house. They had been consumed by it. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with an unintelligible chorus of pain and fury. It was as though the walls themselves were crying out, desperate to be heard. I backed out of the attic, slamming the door shut behind me, feeling the oppressive presence following me down the stairs, pressing against me with a force that felt almost physical. Every instinct told me to leave, to run as far as I could from this house, but something held me in place, a sense of dread mixed with morbid curiosity. I needed answers, and I knew that I wouldn't find peace until I understood what had happened here. The attic door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. But it did little to silence the whispers. They seemed to grow louder, angrier, filling every corner of the house, suffocating me with their presence. My chest tightened as a wave of dread washed over me, every instinct screaming that I was trapped, that there would be no escape from this place. The air was thick, cold, and alive, swirling around me like a vengeful storm. My mind raced, replaying the frantic scrawls in Mrs. Crawford's journal. Her final words etched in fear. "They are coming." I knew, deep down, that I'd made a mistake by disturbing their resting place, by prying into memories that weren't meant to be unearthed. The Crawfords hadn't simply left this house. They had become part of it, and now, so had I. A surge of terror hit me as I realized the whispers weren't just echoes of the past. They were directed at me, urging me to stay, to join them in the darkness that had swallowed this family whole. I ran down the staircase, my flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. Shadows twisted and warped around me, taking forms that seemed almost human but horribly distorted, as though the house itself was mocking my attempts to flee. I reached the bottom of the stairs, breathless, only to find the front door sealed shut. No matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were locked, their frames rattling as though taunting my desperation. The whispers grew louder, now fully intelligible, as if dozens of voices were speaking directly into my mind. They chanted my name, mixed with cries of sorrow, anger, and a demand that I couldn't ignore. Stay. The walls themselves seemed to close in, the room shrinking around me as the Crawfords' restless spirits pressed against me, pulling me deeper into their world. Their faces appeared briefly in the distorted reflections of the windows, pale, sorrowful, their eyes hollow but filled with a fury that sent chills through my veins. In a final, desperate act, I remembered the small door in the attic, the one where I'd found Mrs. Crawford's journals. Something told me that if there was any chance of escape, any way to appease these spirits, it would be through whatever lay behind that door. It was irrational, but so was the nightmare I found myself living. I forced myself to turn around, feeling their presence close behind me, watching, waiting. Climbing the stairs felt like moving through water, every step a battle against an unseen force trying to pull me back. The whispers turned to wails, echoing through the house as though the walls themselves were screaming. When I finally reached the attic, my heart pounding in my ears, the small door seemed to glow with a strange, unnatural light, a faint beckoning. I opened it, and there, hidden in the cramped space, was an old, tarnished mirror covered in dust. Its frame was ornate, Gothic, with engravings that seemed to writhe and pulse under the dim light. My hands shook as I wiped away the dust, revealing a reflection that was not my own. The faces of the Crawfords stared back at me from within the mirror, their expressions frozen in horror and pain, trapped within the glass like specters bound to a prison. Then, in a moment of sheer terror, I saw my own reflection begin to fade, my features distorting, merging with the faces in the mirror as if it was drawing me in. My hands felt numb as the mirror seemed to pull at my very being, an invisible force tugging at my soul, blending me with the anguished figures trapped within. I tried to pull away, but my body felt rooted to the spot, my gaze locked onto the mirror's haunted depths. Desperate, I did the only thing I could think of. With a scream that echoed through the house, I lifted the mirror and smashed it against the floor, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. The wails ceased abruptly, the house falling into an eerie silence, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly. I stood there, breathing heavily, surrounded by fragments of glass, each piece reflecting ghostly images that quickly faded to nothing. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief, as if I had finally broken whatever curse bound the spirits to this place. But then, as I turned to leave, I saw it. A single shard of glass on the floor, reflecting a face I no longer recognized. My own features stared back at me, twisted, hollow, as though I had left a part of myself trapped within the mirror. The silence that followed was deafening, a void filled with the knowledge that somehow I would never truly leave this house. I walked out, numb, the house now silent but forever marked by the memories of what I had witnessed. As I closed the door behind me, a chill ran through me, a whisper lingering in my ear, a final reminder that the Crawfords' that story was not over. And as I left that forsaken place behind, I knew that, just like them, a part of me would remain in that house, bound to its secrets, forever echoing through its dark, haunted halls. I moved to this small, quiet town with the hopes of disappearing, blending into a place where no one knew me, where I could finally find some semblance of peace. After a painful divorce and years of living in a bustling city, the idea of solitude was comforting. The house was modest, a two-story place with worn bricks and overgrown shrubs framing the front. It sat on a street where houses seemed to have been frozen in time, each one casting an aura of eerie stillness. It was perfect, or so I thought. My new street was almost too quiet. I would go for walks during the day and never see a soul outside. It was strange, unsettling even, but I told myself that perhaps everyone here enjoyed their privacy, just like I wanted to. Besides, there was one house directly across from mine that seemed to mirror my own solitude. A tall, imposing structure with all its windows tightly shut, its curtains drawn even during the brightest hours of the day. There was something about that house that caught my attention right away. Maybe it was the way it seemed almost abandoned, with no signs of life around it, yet well-maintained enough that it was clear someone lived there. I never saw anyone come or go. No cars parked in the driveway, no lights flickering on at night. It felt off, as if the house itself was hiding something. But I brushed the thought aside, convincing myself that I was being paranoid, that I was just not used to the eerie silence of small towns. A couple of weeks went by, and I settled into a routine of working from home, only leaving the house for essentials. The isolation felt like a balm for my weary mind. Yet there was one thing I couldn't shake: that house across the street. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself gazing out the window. The street was empty, blanketed in shadows, but my eyes kept drifting toward that darkened house. And then I saw it, a movement behind one of the windows. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light or a stray branch brushing against the glass. But then it happened again, a shadow shifting, like someone walking slowly past the window. I couldn't see any details, just a vague outline, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I closed the curtains, trying to shake off the unease. It was none of my business who lived there, or what they did with their time. Maybe they were just as reclusive as I was. Maybe they worked late hours and were rarely home. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more my curiosity grew. Over the next few nights, I would find myself drawn back to that window, peeking out just to catch a glimpse of movement in the darkened house. Sometimes there was nothing, and other times I would see that shadow again, pacing back and forth as if it were watching me just as intently. It was on one of these nights that I noticed something odd. As I stood there, leaning slightly against my windowsill, I saw the shadow do the same thing. It leaned forward, matching my stance, almost like it was mimicking me. A nervous laugh escaped my lips, though it did little to calm the anxiety bubbling within me. Surely it was just coincidence. After all, I couldn't even see the figure's face. It was just a shadow, an outline. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was intentional, like I was being studied, mirrored. Over the next few days, I became more and more fixated on this strange behavior. Every night I would watch, and every night the figure seemed to mirror my actions with unsettling precision. If I raised my hand, the shadow across the street would raise its hand. If I took a step back, it would retreat as well. It was as if the house across the street was hiding a reflection of myself, an eerie puppet that only came to life in the dark. Sleep became a distant memory, and I found myself caught in this bizarre ritual, unable to stop watching, yet terrified of what I might see. One night, after hours of this silent game, I decided to break the pattern. I raised my hand and waved slowly, half expecting the shadow to wave back. For a moment, nothing happened, and relief washed over me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe there was no one there after all. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. The figure raised its hand in response, a dark, slow wave that seemed to mock my own. I felt a shiver run through me, colder than anything I'd ever felt. But it was what happened next that truly rooted me to the spot, filling me with a dread so deep it seemed to suffocate me. The figure, still waving, stepped closer to the window, and for the first time I saw a glimpse of its face. Or what should have been a face. But it was blank, a dark, featureless shadow, yet unmistakably wearing the same clothes I was. And then it smiled, a hollow, empty smile that stretched impossibly wide. I stumbled back, clutching my chest as my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I shut the curtains, locking out the image of that shadowy smile. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that a door I couldn't see had been opened. The silence of the house felt oppressive, heavy, as if it too was watching, waiting for me to acknowledge the horror across the street. I couldn't get that smile out of my head. It lingered, haunting my thoughts like a shadow creeping through every corner of my mind. Days passed, and I tried to carry on with my routine, to ignore the cold, unsettling feeling that something was wrong. But every time the sun set, a familiar dread settled over me, gnawing away at any sense of peace I'd managed to gather during the day. I stopped sleeping near the window, trying to convince myself that it was a one-time occurrence, that maybe I had just imagined it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Every night, like clockwork, I felt an invisible pull dragging me toward the window, tempting me to look, to check if the shadow was still there. Each night, I resisted the urge until finally the need to know overwhelmed me. It was around midnight when I finally gave in. I crept toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest, my breaths shallow and uneasy. I pulled back the curtain, just a crack, and peered across the street. For a moment, nothing. The house was dark, the windows blank and lifeless. A small relief washed over me, and I let out a shaky breath, convinced that maybe I'd been overreacting. But just as I was about to turn away, I saw it, a faint flicker of movement behind the curtains across the street. The figure was there, lurking just out of reach, but this time it didn't immediately mirror me. Instead, it seemed to be watching me, its dark outline pressing against the glass as though it was studying me with an unnatural intensity. I raised my hand, testing it, and the figure did the same, though this time it felt different. The mimicry was slower, almost mocking, as if it knew I was scared and was reveling in my fear. I quickly pulled the curtain shut, my pulse racing as dread settled like a weight on my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still watching, waiting for me to acknowledge it again. And so, my days became a blur of exhaustion, my nights filled with anxious glances toward the window, each one a small battle of will against the pull of that house across the street. Eventually, I couldn't resist any longer. I began watching the house almost obsessively, searching for some sign of life beyond the shadowed figure that only appeared at night. But during the day, the house was silent, empty, as if whatever inhabited it disappeared with the morning light. There was something profoundly wrong with that place, something that defied logic and reason. Yet I couldn't look away. One night, I felt bold enough to try something different. I pulled out my phone and aimed the camera toward the house, hoping to capture proof of what I was seeing. I zoomed in, my hands trembling as I adjusted the focus and waited. For a few agonizing moments, nothing happened. But then, as if aware of my intentions, the figure appeared at the window, its form taking shape against the dark backdrop of the house. It raised its hand, mirroring my stance, But this time, I noticed something chilling. The hand wasn't quite right. It looked like mine, but distorted. The fingers were elongated, almost skeletal, as if it were a twisted reflection of my own hand. A chill ran down my spine as I snapped a photo, desperate for any evidence that could explain this nightmare. But when I looked down at my phone, my heart sank. The screen was blank. The camera hadn't captured anything but darkness. No matter how many photos I took, the shadow never appeared. It was as if the figure only existed for me, taunting me from the other side of reality. I became consumed by this nightly ritual, my fear slowly transforming into a sick fascination. I needed answers. I couldn't live like this, trapped in my own home, haunted by a reflection that defied all reason. One night, unable to take it anymore, I decided I had to confront whatever was lurking across the street. I needed to know if there was someone there, something real that I could face. Gathering what little courage I had left, I pulled on a coat and stepped out into the night. The air was thick and cold as I crossed the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house loomed before me, tall and dark, its windows like empty eyes watching my approach. I reached the front door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. It felt wrong, like I was crossing a line I could never uncross. But my obsession had taken hold, and there was no going back. With a deep breath, I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The house was silent, colder than I had expected, with a musty smell that clung to the air like a shroud. I stepped inside, and the door creaked shut behind me, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. I stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness, my heart racing as I strained to hear any sign of movement. The silence was oppressive, suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I took a few steps forward, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floor. Shadows clung to every corner, and a strange sense of familiarity washed over me, as if I had been here before, though I knew I hadn't. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the top of the staircase, shrouded in darkness, its form almost identical to mine. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and accusing, like it was silently mocking my intrusion. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from it, the reality of my situation sinking in. I was not alone. The figure stood motionless at the top of the staircase, its dark form blending with the shadows that filled the empty house. My breath hitched as I realized just how wrong everything felt, as if the very air had turned thick with dread. There, in the dim light, the figure didn't seem quite human. It was like a distorted reflection, a twisted version of myself watching me from the darkness. I couldn't move, trapped by the weight of its gaze. I didn't know if it was real or some sick trick of my imagination, but every instinct screamed that I was in danger. A chilling smile crept across the figure's face, a hollow, empty expression that was anything but human. It mimicked the faintest movements of my own, as if mocking every tiny flinch, every tremor that betrayed my fear. I took a step back, heart racing, and the figure mirrored me, its movements slow and deliberate, almost playful. It was then I realized this thing, this presence, was enjoying my fear. Every step I took, it took one too, matching me with an eerie precision. It didn't matter if I ran or stayed still, it knew I couldn't leave. I was trapped. Without thinking, I spun around and bolted toward the door, my feet pounding against the dusty floor, desperate to escape. But just as I reached out for the doorknob, the figure was there, standing impossibly close, blocking my exit. Its face was an inch from mine, yet still blurred, undefined, as though it were some dark reflection just out of focus. My heart thundered as I stumbled back, barely able to breathe. the cold air of the house filling my lungs like ice. I was terrified, but something stronger took over, a need to confront whatever this was, to end this nightmare once and for all. Trembling, I forced myself to speak, my voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, a mocking gesture, its empty eyes narrowing as if it were amused by my question. Slowly, it raised its hand, mirroring mine, fingers stretching in perfect synchrony, each movement a distorted echo of my own. And then, without warning, it lunged forward, its hand reaching out to grasp my own. But instead of a touch, I felt an overwhelming coldness, a void that seeped into my skin and chilled me to the bone. My vision blurred, a dizzying darkness creeping at the edges. I felt myself being pulled, as if the very essence of my being were slipping away, drawn into that shadowy reflection. Panic surged and I struggled to pull away, my hands clawing at the air, but it was useless. The figure's grip was unbreakable, as if it were no longer just an image, but something alive, something real, desperate to consume me. In one final act of desperation, I jerked back with all my strength, the force sending me tumbling to the floor. I looked up, gasping, only to see the figure staring down at me, its hollow eyes dark and unfeeling. It took a slow step backward, its face twisting into a haunting, sinister smile as it faded into the shadows, vanishing into the darkness of the hallway like a nightmare slipping out of reach. I scrambled to my feet, running toward the door, but something caught my eye. A mirror hanging on the wall by the entrance, cracked and ancient, covered in a thick layer of dust. My reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. The eyes in the mirror looked vacant, lifeless, as though my very soul had been drained. And then, in a horrifying realization, I saw the reflection smile, that same hollow, mocking smile I'd seen on the figure. It was me, but it wasn't. I backed away, but my reflection didn't move. It stayed in the mirror, watching me with a cruel amusement, as if it had taken something vital from me, something I could never get back. The chill in the air deepened, and a dreadful silence settled over the house as the realization set in. I hadn't escaped. I had left part of myself behind, trapped within the walls of that cursed place, my own reflection now a prisoner in the twisted void beyond the glass. Without thinking, I ran out of the house, barely stopping to lock the door behind me. I stumbled back across the street to my own home, slamming the door and collapsing on the floor, my heart racing, my mind a blur. But even there, within the supposed safety of my own home, the fear lingered, an oppressive weight pressing down on me. I glanced at my reflection in a small hallway mirror, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw it again, that empty, hollow version of myself staring back. I turned away, vowing never to look in that direction again. But I knew the truth. I was never really alone anymore. Whatever I had seen in that house, whatever had mirrored my every move, had followed me, leaving a piece of itself, or perhaps a piece of me, behind. I would never be able to look into a mirror without the creeping dread of what might stare back. As I sat there, breathing heavily in the darkness, a faint, familiar whisper drifted through the silence, chilling me to the core. "Welcome home."